I'm Amanda Siliker for Canadian HR Reporter TV. Brian Kreissl is the managing editor of Consult Carswell and the co-author of Bill 168 Implementation Guide. He spoke with us on what employers should do to make sure they're ready for Bill 168. Brian, can you tell us exactly what Bill 168 entails?
Sure. Bill 168 is a piece of Ontario legislation that amends the Ontario Occupational Health and Safety Act. It actually comes into force on June 15th, 2010, and it places obligations on employers with regard to workplace violence, workplace harassment, and it also has a couple of interesting provisions regarding the spillover effects of domestic violence in the workplace, and also an obligation placed on employers in terms of having to warn people about individuals they may come in contact with during the course of their work where that person has a history of violence.
What steps do employers really need to take to be prepared for this?
Well, there are really 6 different major obligations that the legislation places on employers. The first is they have to prepare policies around workplace violence and harassment. These have to be written policies, and they have to be posted in a conspicuous place in a case of an employer with 5 or more people. And they have to be communicated to employees, and they have an obligation to review those policies at least on an annual basis. Secondly, they have to create programs that actually implement those policies. Those programs have to include measures for summoning help in the case of workplace violence. They have to look at ways of eliminating or controlling risks. And those programs also have to be communicated to workers. The third obligation that they have is in relation to workplace violence risk assessments. So they have to actually assess each individual workplace and look at what the actual dangers are in that particular workplace with respect to workplace violence. There isn't a similar requirement in terms of workplace harassment, but they do have to go and actually look at each one of their workplaces and figure out what the actual dangers are that are specific to that particular workplace. The fourth requirement really is that employers have to take reasonable precautions where they have reason to believe that there's a danger of domestic violent acts actually occurring in the workplace. So where there's a potential for spillover effects of domestic violence coming into the workplace. There were some high-profile cases in the past of people who had actually come into workplaces and they had assaulted their partners or former partners in the workplace. So the legislation actually puts an obligation on employers to deal with those types of situations, to be aware of them, and to take reasonable precautions where they're aware or where they ought to be aware that such dangers exist. Employers also have an obligation to warn employees where they have reason to believe that they might come into contact with people who are known to have a history of violence in the past. And finally, they have an obligation to allow employees to refuse unsafe work, specifically where there's a danger of workplace violence occurring. The unsafe work provisions don't actually apply with regard to workplace harassment, but if there's a danger that that workplace violence could endanger their safety, then the act is actually going to be amended so that they can have work refusals where someone actually feels that there's a significant danger in working with someone and that there is a danger of workplace violence occurring.